Okay, let's build the Itsy Evo. This is the way the packaging comes. You have some stickers. There's a QR code on the sticker for a build and tune guide for the recommended motor setup. There's the carbon frame parts. You have a base frame and the rotor shield that you're seeing here. All parts are chamfered carbon fiber. About 20 or 30 revs of design went into this frame to make it low harmonic frame for high performance. The hardware kit is in this bag is separated into color-coded baggies for when you build. The green bag is for frame parts and frame build and motor screws. The blue bag is for secondary, the purple bag, sorry, is for secondary smaller motor screws and washers for larger screws if you need them to not screw up your motor windings. The red bag is for standoffs for the frame, and the orange bag is the hardware you'll need to mount your video transmitter in the VTX pod. In addition to the other carbon pieces for the pod, there's also a stretchy battery strap and a bunch of printed parts for camera mount, antenna mount, receiver mount, and even a GPS or drone tag mount for 107 commercial pilots. So let's start with building the frame. First thing you'll need is parts that are in the green bag. These are all M2 by 4 wafer head screws. There's extras included so that if you make a mistake or you drop a few, that you have enough to cover the build. The next part in the red bag is the standoffs, the aluminum standoffs that are needed to build the frame. There are 8 10mm standoffs and 4 15mm standoffs. To build the frame, you're going to need an M1.3 and an M1.5 hex driver. The M1.3 is for the main screws for the frame. This is all in an effort to keep everything about this frame minimal. I've tried to minimize the hardware, perfect the sizes so that we save every fraction of a gram, and that's why this frame is about 5 to 6 grams lighter than the original Itsy, but the frame is significantly more rigid, stronger, and has reduced motor and noise harmonics for smooth flight. So the first thing we're going to do is install all 8 of the standoffs in the frame. I usually start from one corner on the inside working outward, so it's easier to work your way out and assemble things. And we're going to install these 4 screws and standoffs that surround the flight controller first. Generally, I like to get them all on by hand first, and then when we're done and everything is mounted up, we'll torque things down and make sure everything is secure. Now these screws are designed to really only go in 5 to 6 turns. Again, this is all about weight conservation on a rig this small. For every fraction of a gram we save in weight, it gives us better flight time, better performance, allows us to carry heavier motors or larger batteries. So everything about this is minimalistic design, as you would see with fighter aircraft or with race cars, is trying to have functional design with no waste. So now that we have all 8 of those M2 by 10 standoffs mounted, I go ahead and just kind of go through working my way from the outside to the inside ring of standoffs, tightening them down as a process just to make sure that every single one is tightened. Need to be careful with M1.3 that you don't over torque them. Again, use a really good quality driver. These are, I believe, drivers that are made in Germany, so they're very precisely machined, so you can really crank down on those bolts. So now that that's done, the next step is we're gonna use the blue bag, which is all of the custom aluminum hardware for the flight controller stack. Again, the idea of minimizing weight wherever possible is why we've included aluminum hardware for the stack. These tend to be heavy in most builds, and it's important to have a secure connection. And the first step is we're gonna put the main bolt on and hopefully not drop a screw. Once we get it threaded, again, same procedure, get it finger tightened, just kind of maybe cinched down basically. We'll go back through and retighten everything once we get all of the parts in. Not using a nut driver here, just using my fingers to secure it and get it in place. So we're going to do all of these primary flight controller bolts. These are M2 by 12, I believe. And you're going to use the thin aluminum nut to secure the M2 by 12 bolt to the frame. This is important that you don't let your flight controller free float inside of the frame. You want to have this secure so that the flight controller is able to be stabilized on its own rubber shock and vibration mounts, and it just leads to better flying. I think a lot of times pilots will do a build and they will just not secure these bolts to the frame, and they'll just through bolt it with a nut on the flight controller, and that can lead to a lot of problems with flights and with bad gyro traces that you have no way of figuring out what's going on. So this gives us a stable platform. And as you can see, I've lost the bolt, so stand by while I go beneath the workbench and locate it. Okay, and we're back with the missing nut. Let's get this last flight controller mount bolt in. And now, same as with the standoffs, we're going to use a M1.5 driver. Again, you don't want to over torque these. These are aluminum, but just make sure that they're snug. Aluminum is not as hard as steel, but it is significantly lighter. And once these are all tightened, just a visual check, you have all 8 standoffs, all 4 flight controller standoffs. And normally we would mount the flight controller after this and wire up the motors. So that can be done on your own based upon the flight controller and motors you have. But in this case, we're going to secure everything with a nut driver and torque things down. And then we're going to go ahead and put the nylock nuts, they're pink, put the nylock nuts just onto these so that we don't lose them or misplace them until we're ready to drop the flight controller in. The thing I'll mention too, when you mount the flight controller, it's really important that you don't tighten it too much, and you also don't want it loose. You really want the pink aluminum nylock nuts to compress the rubber gummies on the flight controller just slightly so they're under a little bit of compression. A lot of pilots will tighten them down too much, or they'll leave them loose. Both really can lead to all sorts of problems with the flight performance. Ideally, it's very slightly compressed, and usually what I do is once it's touching, I'll do maybe 2 turns of the nut to further tighten the flight controller down onto the mount, and that should provide enough compression on the rubber isolators or gummies to secure the flight controller. All right, so this is now a completed base frame of the Itsy Evo. Now we're going to mount the carbon prop guard, and that's just secured with the same M2x4 screws that were in the green bag. And there are really only four points at which you need to insert them through the top prop guard, the carbon prop guard. These 4 points. The other 4 points in the corners are really designed for the VTX pod to mount to. You'll see that a little bit later. So we'll go ahead and get these mounted up and ready. Again, if you're doing a full build of not just the frame but with the motors, it is easier to put this carbon prop guard on last after you have the motors installed, wired up, flight controller installed, and even receiver installed. And then the last step is you close the frame up by putting the carbon prop guard on like this, and then you'll mount the VTX pod and plug it in to power and to the flight controller. And that's pretty much a complete built base frame of the Itsy Evo. Again, a lot of work has gone into this frame, 30 to 40 variations of the base, just to get to a point where it's lighter and stronger than the original. And that was a significant amount of work that went into that. And so now these are the parts that make up the VTX pod. You have the top and the bottom. The way you can tell is the top has 4 additional holes that if you're going to mount a 20x20 VTX, like a walk snail moonlight, that's the first one on the left. And then there's the bottom VTX pod. Then there's what we call the backbone, which is the camera protector. But to get started, we're going to trim off all of these rubber pieces. This makes me go back to when I was a kid building plastic models. Trim the sprue. Now, I haven't installed it here for weight. It doesn't add much weight, but this is the GPS and RID module holder. It fits right onto the back standoff, and a couple of those same M2x4 screws screwed in from the bottom will secure it if you want to use it, if you're using GPS. But we'll leave that aside to keep the weight low. Every gram counts, and we're going to snip off the camera mounts and the VTX dampener isolator. This is the receiver mount, which you would install on the front standoff. I'll show you that in a minute. Probably should have done that earlier on, which I forgot, but we're going to add it back in. Those 2 small pieces are, if you choose to use the antennas that come with the DJI 03 or with the walk snail, those will allow you to mount those onto the 2 larger 15mm long standoffs on the pod. But for this, we're going to be using a naked 03, and with that, we're using the small UFL antennas that are linear, and they work perfectly fine. I don't see much of a difference between those and the original DJI larger antennas, and it's, again, saves several grams worth of weight. But we need to get that that receiver mount back into the frame so that we have a nice spot to double stick tape our receiver into this when we install the flight controller and all of the electronics. So I'm just getting the standoff pushed in. If you notice, there's a little lip on the bottom. smooth on the top, and that just helps it to keep it from rotating in the frame while you're assembling and while you're flying. This would have been a lot easier to do before the frame was combined. Again, I would do this before, but still possible. A little fidgeting to get it set. Again, using the M1.3 hex driver to screw in the 4mm long screws. All right, now that that's secure, you can see on the inside is where you'd apply a piece of 3M double stick tape to hold your receiver in place. Again, ELRS or Crossfire. Most professional pilots that I know are still using Crossfire, as it's really proven itself to be trustworthy, but it should fit both. These are now the camera mounts. The next step is to take 2 of the 4 M2x15 aluminum standoffs and insert them into the socket in the camera mount. So we just did the first one, we'll do the second one. And this is, I think, coming up what is probably the best sequence to build the VTX pod so that it's relatively easy even to mount a naked DJI O3 air unit. This is the vibration isolator, similar to the OG, the original Itsy. Went through probably about 150 different variations of ways to try to isolate the camera and VTX from motor vibration to reduce and eliminate all jello. And so we haven't changed that design. It's still the same in this Evo compared to the OG. And again, these are the antenna mounts that you can use as an option. We're going to install them on the VTX pod. We're not going to use them, but again, if you're using a naked air unit, you don't need to install these. They're not necessary. They're there in case you're running a full-size air unit and you don't want to run linear or dipole antennas on the transmitter. So we'll just slide these in and get them ready. Usually leave them at the top, so there's a nice loop of wire that can come out of the bottom. You will have to disconnect the UFL connectors on the receiver to feed the wires through these, but we're not going to be showing that today as we're putting in a naked DJI O3 air unit. So look at the bottom of the vibration dampener, and you'll see that there are these 4 holes that have a recessed hole to allow the screws to push through about halfway through the rubber material. So we're going to use 4 of these screws. Generally, you can push them right in and they'll hold, and this is an easy way to build up the VTX pod. So that's 1 position, that's 2 positions, that's the 3rd position, that's the 4th. The other holes you see are for actually mounting the pod to the base frame. So important, this is the bottom, and you want to keep that tab on the left side because that's a space where you can add a 1 gram cooling fan that will keep your air unit cool, especially if you're flying indoors or doing things where you're moving slow and hovering and you don't have a lot of airflow over it. We've done a lot of testing and actually being able to run a full-size air unit for 20 minutes on standby without it overheating, and about 9 to 12 minutes on a naked, where typically after about 2 minutes or even a minute and a half they'll overheat. So there's a provision for a cooling fan that we've had spec'd and produced that fits into the left side of that little notch that you're seeing in the frame. And usually we just hot glue or double stick tape it in, and that fan can be powered off of the flight controller. It draws very little power, but it provides enough cooling to really keep your air unit cool and working when you're doing slow moves or you're flying indoors or when the weather's hot. So now we're just finishing this up. Now you can see this is the camera mount. We're going to mount these two camera mounts using the same M2 by 4 screws, these wafer head screws. And that's basically the base of the VTX pod. You can kind of see the way it lines up. You see the front of it. There's two options for where you can mount your camera, whether you have a naked 03, a standard 03, or even a walk-snail Moonlight, or walk-snail video transmitter for that reason. Now we're going to mount the VTX. For that, we're going to need a small Phillips screwdriver. This is our naked 03. This is the one that has the SD card, so that way we can record a lot of material. These are the two little brackets that go on the top side. Now everything in the orange bag is for mounting the VTX or VTXs to the pod. So you see there's a number of screws. The large and long ones are used for mounting the Moonlight. And there's also a U-shaped spacer you can see in the upper right. That's really only used for the Moonlight, just again to give it some space for mounting, and you'll use the longer screws for that. But in this case, for the naked, you'll be using the shorter M1.6 screws. They're actually M1.6 by 8 millimeters. If you're using the full-size air unit, you'll use the other 4 M1.6 by 10 screws you see in the upper part. But for now, we're using the shorter M8 screws. And again, no need to worry about shorting out the air unit with these screws. These are all stainless steel. They're passivated, so they're not going to conduct electricity. Now, the important thing is to make sure when you install this that the camera cable is on the back of the camera pod, and on the right side when looking from the top down is going to be your SD card and your USB connector. This is the correct orientation. A lot of pilots have had trouble looking at the exploded views to understand this, and I think this video hopefully will help them. And so as you line up that top backbone and the top pod frame mount, we're going to mount up the naked 03, and it's going to bolt through the top plate of the VTX pod. And this can be a little touchy. We'll see if we can get it the first try. It's the most fidgety part of this build because you kind of have some loose PCBs and some aluminum parts that all need to be lined up in order to secure it. But once it's secure, it's really stable. And it actually, I think because the TPU connector, it really helps. So the other thing is that's the battery pad. The battery strap. We need to be prepared to mount that as well. But the first thing we'll do is we want to get these screws inserted into the proper holes, going through the top of the backbone into the frame, into the pod frame, and then into the top of the 03 air unit. So we'll see if we can get this in the first go. I try to get just the first couple of screws so that each of these brackets is secure and threaded properly, but not torqued down, not tightened, but just enough to hold it in place so we can rotate the other small aluminum connector standoff in place. So you can see I'm lining up the holes here, and of course it already popped out, but that's okay. Just take your time. Again, this is the most fidgety part of this. So we're going to reset these little pieces here, and we're going to try again. I'm actually going to do it a little bit differently. I'm going to mount it to one side first. Let's try this. So we'll get one side secured. Don't need all four. Just need to get the first two. And now you'll see antennas go face forward. You can see where the USB is aligned, and you can see now that we're lining up those screw holes, holding it together. And now we're just going to get some of the threads inserted into the naked 03. Let's just make sure they're a little more secure. Oh, I've got one that has slid under the VTX. Try and push it out of the way here. There we go. So you can see now we'll just focus on those last two screws. Once you have one side in, it's easy just to rotate them into place. But before we do that and we tighten things down, we want to make sure we get the battery strap in place. Again, if you're using an 03 full-size air unit, it would be identical to this. It's a little easier, but you really want to get a couple of the screws in first, and then we're going to go ahead and get our battery strap in place. Now, when we tighten this down, it will tighten down against the battery strap. So it's going to be important. That actually helps secure the battery a little tighter, but you'll want to make sure your orientation is correct. It's easy to flip this the wrong way, and then you realize you can't strap your battery down after you've done the build, and you have to kind of loosen things up. So I usually like to get it through and fold the strap over, make sure, okay, we're good. Then we're just going to make the side with the buckle as close to the base of the VTX as we can. Oh, and this one had popped off, so let's go ahead. I didn't thread it in all the way, so let's go ahead and just re-secure this screw. Again, making sure it lines up, and then we can tighten it down. Again, don't have to tighten it down completely tight. You want to have a little bit of space so that you can position the battery strap so it really gets locked into place. But let's get these two screws in, and we'll make that adjustment after. Again, making sure it goes through the aluminum standoff piece and the naked kit. So basically, this is the subassembly for the naked. Again, right side when looking down is where you want to have the USB and the SD card, and the left side will be your bind button. Now we're just going to mount the camera and the VTX into the base of the VTX pod. This is the camera. In this case, we're going to mount it to the frontmost holes. You'll need to use the screws that come with the naked 03 air unit hardware kit. Trying to find the screws amongst all the hardware and carbon and flight controllers and parts that are outside the frame of this build area right now. So there's our motor screws. I'm sorry, our camera screws. Now those where you're going to need the M1.5 driver because they're a much larger screw. The easiest way to do this is screw them through the mount first, so that there's a little bit of a protrusion of the thread. That way you can visually line up the camera, and then you're just going to tighten down both screws once we get them threaded in through the camera mount. Now that we've got that and we've got some threads, we can go ahead and mount the camera. Important to remember, on the Naked, we don't have the ability to flip the image. On the 03, so you want to make sure that the camera cable exits the bottom of the camera as we're looking down on the VTX pod frame here. Right now I'm just going to get these just in and threaded. We can adjust the angle once the build is complete. Important thing to note too is with the Itsy, one of the things that's nice about a lot of pilots don't know is not only can you run very low smoothing in gyro flow, so you have a great field of view, but if you want an extreme field of view, wide field of view, you can use the 03 Rocksteady in wide angle mode, and you'll see no frame in view. So now, if you just twist the camera mounts, there's a little gap and a holder for these linear antennas. These have been modified in the Evo to be a little lower profile, so we can fit 4S batteries and larger 3S batteries on the top of the pod. So to get those in, the easy thing to do is, you can try to press them in, but the easy thing to do is to twist it a little bit, and that opens up the gap, and that will nicely hold in those linear antennas. If for some reason it doesn't go in, you may need to check the mount and make sure that it actually will slip and spread open to allow the antennas. And if not, you can use a pair of trimmers or a knife to just make sure that that slot for those antennas is open. So that's basically how it mounts up. So now we just mate these together, and we're going to use the same M2 by 4mm wafer head screws. There's 4 of them, 2 in the front of the backbone that thread into the M2 by 15 standoffs, and then there's going to be 2 in the back, and we're just going to line these up right now, get it to work. We have yet to, even in hard crashes, wreck even a Naked 03 with this frame. I think part of it has to do with that 03 has a rather delicate silicone processor chip in it that in a hard impact it's easy to crack. Madstech has covered this in some of his videos. I think what is maybe helping all of these Itsys that have been in some pretty horrific crashes and the 03 survive is that bottom vibration isolator that isolates the 03 as a pod from the frame. We're doing it to help remove jello to provide several levels of vibration insulation, but I have to believe that the security of these 03s in crashes is protected by the fact that it often doesn't take a severe shock hit to crack that processor because of that dampener. But anyway, this is the pod. Again, little cable management needed here. Usually just kind of pull the camera cable into an S shape once you get it formed into that shape, that position, and pull it up into the gap behind the 03 camera. It'll stay in place. And the last thing to do here is we're going to mount the VTX pod to the base frame. Now normally you would have, before you do this, you would have your flight controller mounted up, your motors mounted up. Again, depending upon what electronics you're using, we're not showing that part of the build here. We're just trying to build the base frame and give you a tip of how to mount the 03. Now, these are the long screws. This is for Moonlight, very long. Again, it goes through the larger 20 by 20 holes with that U-shaped isolator on the front to give it a little bit of a gap. But really, the 8mm length is what you use for the Naked. So now our last step here is to is to mount the VTX pod to the base frame. Again, we'll use the same unifying hardware, which is an M2x4 wafer head hex bolt. Again, we're using the M1.3 hex driver here. You can screw these in through the TPU. I've seen some pilots use the washers. Really, you don't need to do that. The washers in the kit are really designed for motors, to make sure the motors are tight and you don't screw motor threads into the windings of your motors. A lot of pilots make that mistake and they wonder why the rig catches fire when they first start it up, or why the motors overheat. That's why the washers are there. You shouldn't need them, but you have them. But really don't need the washers here. So we'll go ahead and tidy up these wires. Kind of pull this through and then pull the excess wire into the gap behind the O3 camera here in the front. And that's it. That's the pod. Now these 4 screws, they're going to mate onto points on the frame. You'll see there's kind of 4 cornered holes. These are going to thread right into standoffs and lock everything into place. You don't need to torque these down super tight. They just need to be secure, but you definitely don't want them loose. But don't over torque these. You can pull through the rubber. Haven't really done it, haven't seen anybody do it, but just a warning. You can see here I'm only going like maybe once it's secure, maybe a turn and a half to tighten it down. And that's the base of the Itsy Evo. The battery strap, again, about 12 to 14% lighter than the original. Again, every gram counts, but the big difference is this frame is really solid with resonance. Very low resonance, very high stick response, similar to a 5-inch freestyle in terms of looking at the gyro response time to stick input. These screws are alternative mounts, just so you're aware of it, in the screw bag. For the 4-hole motors, you can use the same M2x4 screws. And we only use 2 screws on the larger motors. You could use 3, or you could use 3 if you need to, but really only 2 are needed to secure. These are not very big motors. Save the weight. And then if you're using the smaller motors that are triangle mount, there are screws. They're M1.4, I believe, by 4 millimeter. That should give you just enough length to tighten those motors down and not ruin the windings of your motors. That's the big reason why in this kit we try to include all this hardware. There's nothing worse than getting a build done and realizing the motor screws that come with the motors are too long or too short. And then you can't fly, you can't finish the build. And so we try to give these, again, this is a washer if you need to make that screw a little shorter. The AMAX motors that we're using, they are actually they are depth threaded, so you can't screw up the motors, in which case you may need to use the washers to secure it, just to make sure. But that's it. That's the build. Happy flying, everybody.